A promising college student, a Friday night party, a suspect hiding in plain sight. A case that should have been solved within days, stretches into decades. 19-year-old Kristin Smart was just like any other college student, full of life, ambition, and dreams of the future. But on May 25, 1996, she walked home from a party, and was never seen again. At first, no one panicked. After all, college students go missing for a day or two, right? Maybe she was with friends, maybe she just needed space. But as hours turned into days, and days into weeks, a chilling truth became undeniable: Kristin Smart wasn't coming back. The last person to see her alive? A fellow student. A young man who claimed he walked her toward her dorm, but never looked back. His name was Paul Flores. He had injuries on his face the next morning. He gave conflicting statements. He had a reputation. But somehow, he walked free. Despite the evidence, despite the suspicions, despite desperate pleas from Kristin's family, years passed. No charges. No justice. No answers. The case would remain cold for 25 years. Then, everything changed. New evidence. New witnesses. A secret buried for decades, finally exposed. And at last, an arrest. But why did it take so long? What really happened that night? And could Kristin's body still be out there, waiting to be found? This is the story of a case that should have been solved years ago. A case of deception, betrayal, and a family that never gave up. Before she became a name in newspaper headlines, before she was the center of a decades-long mystery, Kristin Smart was just a girl with dreams. Born in 1977, Kristin was raised in Stockton, California, alongside her younger siblings. She was the kind of girl who stood out, not just because of her height, but because of her energy. She was fearless. Adventurous. The kind of person who could walk into a room and make friends instantly. She loved the ocean. She loved exploring. She had big plans. Maybe she'd travel the world. Maybe she'd become an architect or a journalist. The future was wide open. In 1996, Kristin was in her first year at Cal Poly, San Luis Obispo. It wasn't just a school for her, it was supposed to be the first step toward something bigger. But college life wasn't easy. Kristin struggled at first. She missed home. She wasn't sure if Cal Poly was the right fit. But she was pushing through. She was making new friends. Finding her way. And that's what makes what happened next so devastating. She was just getting started. Just beginning to find her place. And then, in a single night, it all ended. Imagine being 19 years old. Imagine stepping out on a Friday night, expecting nothing more than a good time, and then, you never make it home. Kristin Smart didn't know that her final night had already begun. But in just a few hours, she would become the subject of one of California's most haunting mysteries. College parties, they're loud, chaotic, and, for most students, just part of the experience. That's exactly what Kristin Smart thought as she made her way to an off-campus party on the night of May 24, 1996. It was the start of Memorial Day weekend, a time for students to unwind before finals. No one knew this night would be the last time anyone would see her alive. Kristin wasn't even supposed to be there. She hadn't made solid plans that night, but at the last minute, she decided to go. A spontaneous decision that changed everything. She arrived at the party late, wearing black shorts, red shoes, and a gray crop top. Witnesses say she stood out, not just because of her height but because of her energy. She was fun, outgoing, maybe a little too trusting. Kristin had been drinking that night, maybe more than usual. Friends noticed she was unsteady, her speech was slurred. But she wasn't alone. Other students were drinking, laughing, dancing, just another weekend night. No one was paying attention. No one realized Kristin was about to disappear. Sometime after 2 a.m., the party started winding down. Kristin needed to get back to her dorm. But she wasn't in any condition to walk alone. She was stumbling, disoriented, vulnerable. Two fellow students, Cheryl Anderson and Tim Davis, agreed to help her get home. They started walking, but before they reached the dorms, another person joined them. A name that would haunt this case for decades, Paul Flores. Paul wasn't some stranger. He was another student at Cal Poly. A quiet, awkward guy. Some people found him unsettling. Others just thought he was socially awkward. But that night, he was in the right place, at the right time. Paul Flores was now the last person with Kristin Smart. And according to him, he walked her as far as his dorm, Santa Lucia Hall. He claimed she was able to walk on her own. He claimed he watched her continue toward her own dorm. And that was it. But here's the problem. No one ever saw Kristin Smart again. Saturday morning came. No sign of her. Friends assumed she was sleeping in. But by Sunday, concern was growing. By Monday, it turned into panic. Her parents knew something was wrong. They called campus security. They called the police. But the response? Underwhelming. Authorities didn't take it seriously. A missing college girl? She must have run off. Maybe she was partying somewhere else. They waited. And waited. And waited. And by the time authorities realized Kristin Smart wasn't coming back, crucial evidence was already lost. Paul Flores would tell his version of events. But others would tell a very different story. Stories of contradictions, injuries, and suspicious behavior. Stories that made it clear, Paul Flores knew more than he was saying. The last confirmed sighting of Kristin Smart was May 25, 1996. After that, she was gone. The morning after Kristin Smart vanished, the world continued as if nothing had changed. But in Stockton, California, her parents felt something was wrong. Deeply wrong. Stan and Denise Smart knew their daughter. She wasn't irresponsible. She wasn't reckless. And she never went this long without reaching out. By Sunday, concern turned into fear. By Monday, it was full-blown panic. The Smarts contacted Cal Poly, hoping someone, anyone, had seen Kristin. What they heard next would make their blood run cold. Kristin had been missing for over 48 hours, but the university had done little, if anything, to look for her. Why? Because they didn't believe she was in danger. The official response? She was probably off somewhere, blowing off steam. Maybe she had gone on a spontaneous trip. Maybe she was sleeping it off at a friend's place. There was no sign of foul play, so there was no reason to act quickly. It took 4 days, 4 crucial days, before Kristin Smart was officially reported missing to law enforcement. And by the time investigators finally took notice, key evidence had already slipped away. When investigators finally started asking questions, one name kept coming up, Paul Flores. He was the last person seen with Kristin. And right away, something about his story didn't sit right. Paul claimed he walked Kristin back toward her dorm. That was his story. Simple. Harmless. But as investigators pressed him for details, his version of events kept shifting. The inconsistencies were alarming. But there was something even more disturbing, the injury on Paul Flores' face. By the time investigators interviewed him, Paul had a fresh bruise under his eye. His explanation? He got it while playing basketball. But no one could confirm that. And here's the thing, his own teammates never remembered him getting hurt. No one saw him take a hit to the face. But they did notice something else, how nervous he seemed when Kristin's name came up. One of the biggest mistakes in this case? The search, or rather, the delay in searching Paul Flores' dorm room. It took weeks before authorities searched his room. And by then, whatever evidence had been there was long gone. But even then, something felt off. The mattress had been removed. The room had been scrubbed clean. And there was something strange about the cadaver dogs. When trained dogs were brought in to search for Kristin's scent, they didn't alert in random places. They went straight to Paul Flores' mattress. And that? That was enough to send chills down investigators' spines. From the very beginning, there was one suspect. One person whose story didn't add up. One person who had been the last to see Kristin alive. And yet, no arrest was made. No body. No physical evidence. No witnesses who saw what really happened. Law enforcement believed Paul Flores knew the truth. But proving it? That would be a battle that lasted decades. Kristin Smart was gone. Her family was searching for answers. And Paul Flores? He was walking free. But he wouldn't be free forever. For most families, when a child leaves for college, they come home for the holidays. They call on weekends. They visit during summer. But for Stan and Denise Smart, their daughter never came home. And in the days, weeks, and months after her disappearance, they realized something even more painful. No one was fighting for her the way they were. Law enforcement had a prime suspect. They had enough to at least build a case. But instead, days turned into months. Months turned into years. The investigation stalled. Leads dried up. And the person who last saw Kristin? He was still out there, living his life. So if authorities weren't going to act, the Smarts decided they would. With no criminal charges in sight, the Smarts took an unusual step. In 2002, 6 years after Kristin disappeared, they filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Paul Flores. The lawsuit accused Paul of causing Kristin's death. It wasn't about money. It was about the truth. About forcing him to answer for what happened that night. But Paul never spoke. He pleaded the fifth. Again. And again. And again. The lawsuit didn't bring Kristin back. It didn't bring justice. But it kept her name in the public eye. And that? That was something. Years passed. The case faded from headlines. But in 2019, a single voice changed everything. Chris Lambert, a musician, not a detective, decided to take another look at the case. He started a podcast, hoping to shine a light on what had been forgotten. What he uncovered? It was more than anyone expected. Witnesses who had never spoken publicly started coming forward. New details emerged. And the world started asking the same question again: why is Paul Flores still free? Suddenly, authorities couldn't ignore Kristin's case anymore. The podcast sparked renewed public outrage. The Smart family's fight was no longer just theirs, it was everyone's. And with pressure mounting, investigators made a stunning announcement. More than 2 decades after Kristin vanished, investigators returned to places that should have been searched long ago. And this time? They weren't just looking. They were digging. What they found would change everything. For years, the case of Kristin Smart remained in limbo. Her family fought. The public demanded answers. But without solid proof, authorities couldn't make an arrest. Then, in 2020, 24 years after Kristin vanished, everything changed. Law enforcement wasn't just revisiting old leads. This time, they had something new. Something real. And they knew exactly where to look. For years, investigators suspected that Paul Flores had helped covering up Kristin's disappearance. But without hard evidence, no arrests were made. That all changed when detectives received a tip, one that led them to his father's home. This wasn't just any tip. This was specific. And when investigators arrived, they didn't just search. They dug. Beneath a deck at Ruben Flores' home, soil samples revealed something chilling, evidence that a human body had been there. It was clear, someone had been buried in that exact spot. And then? They were moved. For over 2 decades, Kristin Smart's remains may have been right there, hidden beneath Paul Flores' own father's property. And someone had gone to great lengths to make sure she was never found. But investigators weren't just searching Ruben Flores' property. They also turned their attention to Paul's own home. And what they found only deepened their suspicions. Trained cadaver dogs signaled human decomposition near Paul's bed. And forensic teams collected evidence that could finally prove what had been suspected for years. As news of the searches spread, something unexpected happened. People started talking. Witnesses who had stayed silent for years finally found the courage to come forward. And the stories they told were damning. Paul Flores wasn't just a suspect in Kristin Smart's case. He had a pattern. A history. And for the first time, the world was seeing it clearly. On April 13, 2021, after 25 years, Paul Flores was finally arrested and charged with Kristin Smart's murder. Ruben Flores was also arrested, accused of helping his son cover up the crime. The father who had stood by him all these years, the one who had likely hidden Kristin's remains, was finally being held accountable. But even with an arrest, the fight wasn't over. It had taken 26 years to get here. 26 years of waiting, fighting, hoping. And now, inside this courtroom, Kristin Smart's family would finally hear the words they had been desperate for: guilty or not guilty? The trial of Paul Flores began in July 2022 in Monterey County. Prosecutors had a mountain of circumstantial evidence, chilling witness accounts, and forensic discoveries pointing to one conclusion: Paul Flores had killed Kristin Smart. Paul had always been the last person seen with Kristin. His stories had shifted. He had evaded questioning for years. But in this courtroom, there was nowhere left to hide. Testimony after testimony painted a grim picture. Former classmates described Paul as a predator, a man known for making women uncomfortable. Women from his past came forward, sharing disturbing accounts of his behavior. One after another, voices that had been silent for years finally spoke. The defense team argued that without physical proof of Kristin's remains, there was no way to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Paul had killed her. They pointed out inconsistencies in witness accounts and tried to cast doubt on the evidence. But the jury wasn't just looking at evidence. They were seeing patterns. They were hearing stories. And with every disturbing account, the truth became clearer. After 26 years, Paul Flores was convicted of murdering Kristin Smart. It was a moment that so many had waited for, but one that still carried unbearable pain. Despite strong suspicions that Ruben Flores had helped cover up his son's crime, the jury found him not guilty of being an accessory after the fact. He walked free. The conviction was a victory, but it wasn't closure. Kristin's remains have never been found. And for her family, that will always be the unfinished chapter in this story. Paul Flores now faces 25 years to life in prison. But the Smart family still waits for the day when they can finally bring their daughter home. Justice has been served, but the story isn't over. Because one question still haunts this case: where is Kristin? Since the day Kristin disappeared, authorities, volunteers, and private investigators have searched tirelessly for her remains. But despite years of digging, scanning, and following leads, her body has never been found. In 2020, authorities excavated under Ruben Flores' deck and found evidence suggesting human remains had once been there. But by the time they arrived, Kristin's body was gone. Had she been moved again? And if so, where? Many believe Kristin was initially buried under Ruben Flores' deck, the same location where ground-penetrating radar showed soil disturbances. But if Paul and his father panicked and moved her, where did they take her next? Some experts suspect Kristin's remains could be hidden in a remote area outside Arroyo Grande, a place the Flores family had access to. If buried deep enough, finding her could take decades. Another chilling theory suggests that Paul and his father disposed of Kristin's body in the Pacific Ocean. Given San Luis Obispo's coastal location, this would have been a devastatingly effective way to eliminate evidence. Some believe Kristin's remains may still be on land owned by the Flores family, hidden in an undiscovered location, a well, a drainage pipe, or even inside a sealed structure. Without a confession, the truth remains buried. But for Kristin's family, these theories aren't just speculation. They represent an agonizing reality: their daughter is still missing, and the man responsible refuses to reveal the truth. Kristin's case didn't just lead to an arrest, it changed the way missing persons investigations are handled in California and beyond. After Kristin's disappearance, it was discovered that Cal Poly failed to report her missing for days. This delay cost precious time. In response, California passed the Kristin Smart Campus Safety Act, requiring universities to immediately notify law enforcement when a student is reported missing. Kristin's case also highlighted flaws in how missing adults are treated by law enforcement. Today, there's greater public awareness, better forensic technology, and more resources dedicated to solving long-term disappearances. For 26 years, the Smart family fought for justice. They endured heartbreak, frustration, and setbacks. But they never gave up. And in 2022, they finally saw Paul Flores convicted. Justice was delayed, but not denied. Yet one mystery remains: where is Kristin? Until that answer is found, her story isn't over. Kristin Smart's case is a painful reminder that the fight for justice doesn't end in a courtroom. It continues in the search for truth. If you want to see more cases like this covered, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share this story. Because together, we can keep these stories alive. What do you think about this case? Do you believe more people were involved in Kristin's disappearance? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We want to hear from you. If you haven't already, subscribe to Family Betrayals, True Crime Chronicles for more in-depth coverage of heartbreaking cases like Kristin Smart's. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss a story.